What would you do if the whole town warned you off a place, called it cursed, called it forgotten, called it not worth the mule ride up, and still you rode? What would you do if the deed handed to you across a scarred pine counter cost nothing but a signature and the promise never to speak of what you found inside? Catherine Brooks, 18 years old, was given a cabin sealed for 80 years above the town of Falls Creek. Signed over for $1 and a keep quiet die, and everyone from the livery boy to the preacher's wife told her to burn the paper and forget the road. But what waited behind that swollen door had been waiting the whole time for someone stubborn enough to lift the latch. Settle in. Ride with her a while. Let us know where you're listening from tonight. The wagon road out of Falls Creek climbed in slow switchbacks along a shoulder of red rock, and Catherine rode it in the last blue hour before dawn with her father's coat buttoned to the throat and her mother's rosary in her apron pocket, though she had not said a proper prayer in almost a year. The mare beneath her was named June, 16 years old, gray at the muzzle, sway-backed in the way of horses that have been asked too much and given it anyway. June knew the road better than Catherine did. June had climbed it once before, long ago, with a man Catherine would not think about yet. The valley opened above her in stages. First, the pines thinned to a scatter of black spear points against the paling sky. Then a shelf of granite showed itself, water-stained and streaked with rust from old iron seeps. Then the sound came. A low, continuous exhalation, felt in the ribs before it was heard. The sound of a waterfall pushing itself off a lip of stone and falling more than 100 feet into a bowl of moss and mist. Catherine drew rein a moment and let June breathe. She listened. She had heard that sound in her sleep for weeks, though she had never in her life been within a mile of the place. The past year had taken from her almost everything a year can take. Her father, Amos Brooks, had died in the spring of a fever that came through the boarding houses like a rumor and left 3 graves in the churchyard behind the store. Her mother had followed him before the ground had settled, not from the fever, but from the quiet, which is a thing that kills as surely as any illness on the frontier. The store had gone to a bank in Denver that Catherine had never seen and never would. The house behind the store had gone to a man named Halloran who ran the freight office and who had smiled at Catherine across the counter the day the papers were signed as if he were doing her a favor by letting her keep her mother's clock. She had kept the clock. She had kept her father's coat and her mother's rosary and a Winchester rifle her father had never fired at anything living. She had kept June. She had kept a folded square of yellow paper that had been placed into her hand 3 weeks earlier by an old man named Ezra Pike, who had walked into the mercantile on the morning of the auction, waited until every other creditor had picked over what was left, and then set the paper down on the counter in front of her as if he were laying down a bird he had carried from a great distance. "That's yours if you'll take it," Ezra had said. His voice was dry as chaff. "$1 makes it legal. Silence keeps it yours." Catherine had looked at the paper without touching it. Deed of gift. Cabin and appurtenances. Section 31, Township North, above the falls. Signed in a hand so old the ink had gone the color of weak tea. Underneath, in a fresher line, Ezra's own signature. "Why me?" she had said. Ezra had looked at her a long moment. His eyes were the pale gray of river stones under moving water. He had known her father. He had known her father's father. He was the last of a generation that had come into the valley when there had been no valley yet. Only a rumor of grass and a promise of gold that had turned out to be neither. "Because you're the last Brooks," he had said, "and it's a Brooks matter. Always was." She had not understood him then. She had not asked. She had taken the $1 from her own thin purse and set it on the counter, and Ezra had folded it into his vest, without looking at it, and had walked back out into the wind without another word. 2 days later, she heard he had gone north to his sister's place in the high country and was not expected to return before winter, if at all. That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of sleeping in the loft above the livery for the price of grooming the stalls. 3 weeks of eating what the blacksmith's wife brought her in a tin pail out of pity and out of an old friendship with Catherine's mother. 3 weeks of the town looking at her the way towns look at girls who have been left with nothing, kindly, briefly, and then past her toward whatever was next in their own day. The paper had stayed folded in her apron the whole time. She had opened it only twice. Once by lantern light in the loft to be sure she had not dreamed it. Once by the water pump behind the livery in the middle of a windy afternoon to be sure the words had not rearranged themselves. Both times the ink had stayed put. Both times she had folded it again and put it away, and both times she had not been ready to ride. She had become ready last night, though she could not have said what changed. Halloran had come into the mercantile at supper hour to buy a can of peaches, and he had looked at her across the counter. She was clerking now for the man from Denver for a wage that would not have kept a dog fed. And he had said loud enough for the 2 men behind him to hear, "Still here, Miss Brooks. Thought you'd have followed your folks out of the county by now." She had not answered him. She had counted his change into his palm and had watched him tip his hat to her the way a man tips a hat to a lamppost. When he had gone, she had put down the coin scoop and had walked into the back room and had stood with her forehead against the cool plaster and had understood, in a way she had not understood before, that she was not going to be allowed to stay. Not by Halloran and not by the town and not by the small mean voice in her own chest that had begun, in the last 3 weeks, to agree with them. She had gone to the livery at 4 in the morning and had saddled June by lantern. She had rolled her father's coat and a blanket and a change of stockings and the Winchester into a bedroll behind the cantle. She had taken a lantern of her own and a tin of matches wrapped in oilcloth and a hatchet and a small crowbar the blacksmith had once given her father as a Christmas gift, and half a loaf of brown bread and a wedge of cheese and a canteen of clean water from the pump. She had taken the paper from her apron and pinned it inside her shirt against her skin because she did not entirely trust her own pockets. She had led June out of the stable without waking the boy who slept in the tack room, and she had ridden through the sleeping town without meeting a single lit window, and she had turned north where the road forks at the Baptist churchyard, and she had begun to climb. Now, 4 hours later, the sky was going pearl above the ridge, and the sound of the falls was steady in her bones, and June had stopped of her own accord in a small flat place where the road bent and a stand of aspens made a pale shivering wall against the wind. Catherine dismounted stiffly. Her legs ached at the hip where the saddle had worked her. She loosened June's girth by a hole and pressed her forehead a moment to the mare's warm neck and stood that way, breathing in the smell of horse and wet leather and the faint iron of the rock all around. "Just us," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she had meant. June flicked one ear back toward her and blew a soft breath at the ground. Catherine took the folded paper from inside her shirt and opened it once more, though she did not need to read it. The words were memorized. She wanted only to see the ink hold. It held, Section 31, above the falls. She refolded it and slid it back against her skin and lifted her eyes to the ridge above her, where the road bent one more time out of sight and where, according to the paper and according to Ezra Pike, and according to a rumor Catherine had heard whispered in the town since she was old enough to eavesdrop, a cabin had stood untouched for 80 years, built against the rock beside the water. Its door swollen shut, its window shuttered from within, its name spoken only in the low registers of men who had been children the last time anyone had lived in it. She had asked, the day before she left, an old ranch hand named Woodrow, who took his coffee at the mercantile each morning, what he knew of the place above the falls. Woodrow had set his cup down very carefully. He had looked at her for a long moment across the counter, in the same measuring way Ezra had looked at her, as if trying to decide whether she was old enough to hear or young enough to be spared. "Not a cabin," Woodrow had said at last. "A grave with a roof on it. Leave it be, girl." He had not said anything else. He had drunk his coffee and paid his nickel and gone out into the street and had not come to the mercantile the next morning, though he had come every morning for as long as Catherine could remember. She thought of him now, standing in the aspens with the pale sky brightening behind the ridge and her father's coat too big at her shoulders, a grave with a roof on it. She turned the phrase in her mind the way a person turns a stone in the palm to feel its weight. It did not frighten her the way it should have. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks, the part of her that could be frightened by a phrase like that had gone very quiet, and in its place a stubbornness had settled that felt, she thought, a little like her father's silence at the end of a long day. She tightened June's girth. She swung back into the saddle. She touched the mare with her heel and the mare walked on. The road bent and rose, and the sound of the water grew larger until it filled the whole valley, and then the road came out onto a broad ledge of stone, and Catherine saw for the first time, plainly, in the first true light of the morning, the place she had come to open. The falls poured down on her left, a white column against black rock. To the right of the column, tucked into a fold where the cliff overhung and the mist hung constant, stood a cabin. Its roof was pine shakes gone the color of old bone. Its walls were plank, set on plank, dark with moss, dark with damp. Its single window was shuttered with iron. Its door faced the water, and the water fell so close that a fine drift of spray was blowing against the boards even now, in the still hour before the wind rose. There was no path to the door. There had not been a path in a very long time. Catherine sat June in the middle of the ledge and looked at the cabin and did not, for a long moment, breathe. Something inside the shuttered dark behind that door had waited 80 years for a hand on the latch. She could not have said how she knew it. She knew it the way she had known the sound of the falls in her sleep. She swung down from the mare and began to walk. The stone of the ledge was slick where the mist reached it, and she went carefully in her father's boots, which were a size too large and had been packed at the toe with wool so that they would not slide on her heel. June stood where she had left her, reins dropped, one hip cocked, watching the way an old horse watches, without expectation and without leaving. Catherine crossed the ledge in a slow curve, keeping to the drier stone, and when she reached the wall of the cabin she put her palm flat against the plank without meaning to. The wood was cold. It was cold the way a stone in a creek is cold in July. The damp had gone all the way through it and come out the other side and made a home of it. She walked the length of the front wall to the door. The door was heavier than she had imagined a door could be. It was made of 3 broad vertical planks, bound with iron straps, and the iron had rusted to the color of dried blood, and the straps had swollen the wood along their edges so that the whole face of it looked bruised. The hinges were set into the rock itself on the right side, driven into the cliff with pins she could not see. On the left side, there was no knob. There was a latch of forged iron, a simple thumb lift, and above it a hasp with no lock through it. Someone 80 years ago had closed this door and walked away, and had not troubled to lock it, because they had known already that the swelling of the wood and the working of the damp would do the locking for them, more thoroughly than any key. Catherine stood in front of the door with her hands at her sides. She thought, quite clearly, that she could turn around now. She could walk back to June and mount and ride down the wagon road and be in Falls Creek before the sun crossed the ridge, and she could tell the blacksmith's wife she had lost her nerve, and the blacksmith's wife would feed her and not judge her, and Halloran would still find a way to move her out of the county. But she would go with her mother's clock and her father's coat and her mother's rosary and June, and she would find work in another town, and this door would stay closed for another 80 years, and no one would blame her, because no one had asked her to open it in the first place. No one but a stranger with a folded square of yellow paper and a single dollar. She thought that, and then she pressed her thumb to the latch. The latch did not move. She had not expected it to. She reached back to her hip and unhooked the small crowbar from the loop where she had hung it, and she set the flat end into the seam between the door and the jamb, low, near the bottom where the swelling looked worst, and she leaned her weight into the iron. Nothing gave. She adjusted the crowbar higher, near the latch, and set her shoulder to it, and pulled. The wood groaned. It was the first sound the cabin had made, and it did not sound like wood. It sounded like something breathing out that had held its breath a very long time. She stopped. She listened. Behind her the falls poured on, and the mist blew against her neck, and June shifted one hoof on the stone. Catherine set the crowbar again. She worked it. She worked it patient and slow, the way she had watched her father pry the lid off a crate of nails in the store on a winter afternoon, humming under his breath, "No hurry in him." The crate opening not because he forced it, but because he outlasted it. She thought of that humming. She thought of him. She set her weight and pulled and set her weight and pulled. And the seam widened by a hair, and then by another hair, and then a long splinter of the jam tore free with a sound like cloth ripping in another room, and the door shifted in its frame by the width of 2 fingers. She braced her boot against the rock and pulled harder. The door came open on the 3rd real heave, not swinging but staggering, dragging its bottom edge across the plank sill so that a thin curl of black wood shaved up in front of it. A breath came out of the cabin. That was the only way she could think of it afterward. Not a draft, not a smell, a breath. Cool and old and slightly sweet, the way the inside of a hymnal smelled when it had been shut in a pew for a long August, and under the sweetness a mineral cold, like the taste of a copper coin held on the tongue. Catherine stepped back from it. She stood a little to the side of the doorway with the crowbar in her hand, and let the cabin exhale into the morning until the exhale had ended and the mist from the falls began to drift in and take its place. Then she looked in. The dark inside was not the flat dark of a shut room. It was layered. It had shapes in it. Something at the far wall showed as a pale rectangle where light must be leaking through a warp in the shutter. Something nearer showed as the edge of a table. Something on the table showed as a curve that might have been a bowl or a lamp base. She could not tell. She could smell now, past the first breath, pine sap gone hard, kerosene long dry, wool that had been wet many times and dried many times, and under it all the faint particular smell that she remembered from her father's coffin the morning of the burial, the smell of a place a person had lived in for years and then not lived in at all. Catherine did not step inside. She turned and walked back across the ledge to June, and June lifted her head and blew softly through her nose, and Catherine put her forehead against the mare's warm neck for a count of 10, and the smell of horse and dust and old leather steadied her the way nothing else could have. She untied the lantern from the saddle. She took the tin of matches from her saddlebag, unwrapped the oilcloth, and set one match against the striker. It caught. She lit the wick and closed the glass and turned the flame down small, because a small flame in a strange room told the truth better than a large one. She carried the lantern back to the door. At the threshold she paused and said quietly, not to the cabin, and not to herself, but to whatever the cabin still contained, "I mean no harm." It was the sort of thing her mother had said before entering a sick room, and Catherine had not known she remembered it. She lifted the lantern and stepped over the sill. The floor held her. That was the first thing. She had expected it to sag or to give, and it did neither. The planks were thick and had been laid across joists set into the rock, and they took her weight without a sound. The second thing was the ceiling. The ceiling was low. So low she could have reached up and touched it, and it was not made of shakes, but of dressed timber, planed smooth, fitted tight. Whoever had built this room had built it to last past themselves. The third thing was that the room was not empty. A plank table stood along the wall opposite the door, a bench beside it, an iron stove in the near corner with its pipe going up through the roof, a bedstead against the back wall with a mattress on it that had gone dark and shapeless, and on a shelf above the bedstead a row of tins and a book and a candle stub in a pewter dish, and at the end of the shelf something small and dark that she did not at first recognize as a boot. A single boot, left foot, set upright as if its owner had meant to come back for it. Catherine lifted the lantern higher and stood in the middle of the room and turned once, slowly, and the light moved with her over the walls, and the walls showed her marks. A nail here with nothing hanging from it, a shape on the plank where a picture frame had once kept the wood behind it lighter than the wood around it, a line of pencil at eye height, with a name written beside it in a child's hand. The letters faded almost past reading. She did not lean in to read the name yet. She was not ready. She stepped back out into the light. June was watching her from the ledge. The sun had climbed enough now that it touched the top of the falls and turned the upper water gold, while the lower water stayed white, and the whole column of it seemed to be pouring out of the morning itself. Catherine set the lantern down on the sill and put her hand against the doorframe and breathed. 80 years. 80 years of spray and freeze and thaw and no boot on the sill and no smoke in the pipe, and inside a boot still upright on a shelf, as if its owner had just stepped out. 80 years of a town below saying grave with a roof on it, and not one of them coming up to see whether the words were true. And a folded square of yellow paper in a stranger's hand, and $1 out of her purse, and her name, her father's name, her father's father's name, threaded through the whole thing like a single dark strand of yarn through a piece of plain cloth. Now, before Catherine steps back through that door with the lantern in her hand, a question worth sitting with. What would make an old man like Ezra Pike wait until the last Brooks was orphaned and cornered before pressing a deed into her palm for a single $1? What is the boot on the shelf still waiting for? And whose child wrote a name on the wall in pencil at eye height 80 years ago? If a story like this holds you, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you'd like the rest of it to find you, a like and a subscribe is how it will. Now settle in. Catherine is about to pick the lantern up again, and the light is about to fall on the name on the wall. But she did not pick it up right away. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and let the cold sweetness of the cabin's breath move past her cheek, and she thought about what Woodrow had said, and what Halloran had said, and what Ezra Pike had said, and how none of the three sets of words seemed to belong to the same country. Woodrow had said grave, Halloran had said gone, Ezra Pike had said Brooks. Catherine turned the three words over in her hand the way a man turns 3 stones looking for the one that will strike a spark. She thought about going down. Not all the way down, not yet, but down as far as the shoulder of the road where a spring came out of the rock and a person could rest a horse and think. She thought about how long it had been since she had spoken with anyone who did not either want her out of Falls Creek or want her to be quieter about staying. The blacksmith's wife did not count. The blacksmith's wife fed her. The mist from the falls beaded on the plank sill and slid down into the older wet that had been living there for 80 seasons. Catherine watched a single drop travel the length of the sill and fall into the moss below, and something in the smallness of it steadied her. She left the lantern on the sill. She walked back to June and untied the reins from where she had knotted them loose around a stubby ledge stone. She did not mount. She led the mare across the ledge and back onto the wagon road where the aspens started, and she took June down 100 paces to a place where a shelf of grass grew out of a crack in the rock and the sun already reached. There she loosened the girth another hole, took the bit out of June's mouth, and let the mare put her nose down into the grass. June ate slowly, the way she did everything, working the grass with her old teeth and not lifting her head to look at Catherine. Catherine crouched with her back against the rock and ate a slice of the brown bread and a corner of cheese and drank 3 swallows from the canteen. She had not eaten since noon of the day before. The bread tasted of the blacksmith's wife's stove. The cheese tasted of nothing. She sat with her father's coat pulled around her and watched June and thought about the pencil line on the wall of the cabin at eye height. Eye height for a child, not eye height for a man, not for a woman. For a child perhaps 5 or 6 years old, standing straight, marking his or her own name on the plank where a mother could see it and be proud. She thought of the small dark boot on the shelf and then would not let herself think of it further, because she was alone above a waterfall on a ledge, and she could feel her breath want to catch in her ribs. She had come up here to be alone with a thing. Now the thing had a name in pencil on its wall, and she did not yet know whose. She rested until the sun was fully over the ridge, and the ledge behind them was in bright day. Then she stood, took up the bit, put it back gently into June's mouth, and led the mare down the wagon road. She did not go all the way to Falls Creek. She went as far as a place she knew from childhood, where a 2-track cut off the main road and dropped through pine to a low sheep meadow and a set of pole corrals that had belonged to a family called Merriweather until the boys grew up and left, and now belonged to no one in particular, and where an old ranch hand named Woodrow Sipe kept his rope-broke roan and a shed of tools and, on a Wednesday, could sometimes be found mending fence. It was a Wednesday. She smelled his fire before she saw him. Woodrow had a coffee pot on a bed of coals beside a rail of split cedar, and he was setting a staple with a hammer into a new post when Catherine and June came around the last bend. He straightened slow, one hand on the small of his back, and looked at her without surprise. Woodrow Sipe was 70 if he was a day, with white brows and a face like a piece of tack leather that had been oiled once too seldom, and eyes so pale they seemed to have been washed of their color by long weather. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Mr. Sipe. You come down." "I come down part way." He nodded once as if that were an acceptable answer and set the hammer against the post and reached for the coffee pot. He poured a tin cup half full and held it out toward her. She took it. The tin burned her fingers through the wool of her glove, and she was glad of the burn. "You made the door," he said. She did not ask him how he knew. She said, "I made the door. Went in. A step. Come out. A step." He nodded again. He poured himself no coffee. He set the pot back on the coals and lowered himself onto the top rail of the corral with the care of a man who has learned the exact cost of each of his own movements. June wandered to the rail and put her nose against his knee, and he laid his old hand flat on the mare's face without looking down. Catherine drank. The coffee was black and bitter and old, and it did what coffee is meant to do. "I told you a grave with a roof on it," Woodrow said. "You did. I meant it kindly. I know it." He was quiet for a long while. A hawk went over the meadow, and its shadow crossed the corral and moved on. Woodrow watched it out of sight. "There is a man in the valley," he said at last, "who has spent 40 years making sure nobody remembered why that door was shut. He is not old yet. He is not young either. He was a boy when the door was shut, and a boy remembers what a man forgets on purpose. You understand me, Miss Brooks." "Not fully. You will." He looked at her then, and his pale eyes were kind, and they were also afraid, and Catherine saw both things sitting quiet beside each other in his face. "Whatever you find on the shelf," Woodrow Sipe said, "you set it back the way you found it, and you tell no one in Falls Creek what you saw, and you do not go up alone after dark, not until the moon fills once." "Why the moon?" "Because a man who has forgotten for 40 years does not remember all at once. He remembers by pieces, the way ice comes off a pond. And the pieces of him you would not want to meet come loose first." Catherine held the tin cup in both hands. She said, "Who is he?" Woodrow shook his head, small and slow. "If I say the name, I have said it. If I do not, you will know it when you see him, and you will know it because he will already know you. That is enough for a Wednesday." She wanted to press him and did not. She had been raised by her father to know when a man had given all he intended to give and when pushing would only cost her the rest. She drank the last of the coffee and handed back the cup. Woodrow Sipe took the cup, and then he did a thing that surprised her. He rose from the rail, took her right hand in both of his, and turned it palm up. Her palm was scraped from the crowbar and pink at the heel. He looked at it a long moment. "A Brooks hand," he said. "Your grandfather had a hand like that, broad at the knuckle. Your father, too. He built the counter of that mercantile with a hand like that, and the man from Denver stands behind it now and does not know whose work he leans on." He let her hand go. "Go back up," he said. "Go back up while it is light. Look at what is on the shelf. Look at what is written on the wall. Do not touch the mattress on the bed. Come out. Shut the door as close to shut as it will go. Ride down. Sleep in the loft. Come to me on Friday if you can. I will not be here Thursday. I do not want to be seen with you on Thursday." "Why?" "Because Thursday is the day he comes to the freight office to draw his mail." That was all he would say. Catherine knew it and did not ask again. She tightened June's girth, took the reins, and led the mare back up the 2-track toward the wagon road. When she reached the turn, she looked back once. Woodrow Sipe was setting the staple again with the hammer, as if he had never stopped, and he did not look up. She rode back up the road with a colder understanding sitting beside her father's coat. She did not go straight to the ledge. She stopped at the spring on the shoulder, let June drink, and rested a hand on the mare's withers for the count of 10 she had been giving herself all morning as a small ritual. Then she went on. The ledge, when she reached it again, was in full sun. The white column of water was too bright to look at straight, and the mist blew across the stone in shifting bands. The lantern still sat on the sill of the cabin where she had left it. The door still stood open the width of a man's shoulder. The little cabin looked, for the first time, less like a grave and more like a room that had been waiting. She thought of the child's pencil line at eye height. She thought of Woodrow's hand turning her palm up. She thought of a name she did not yet know and a face she had not yet seen. Before she crossed to the door, she led June to the deepest fold of rock at the back of the ledge where the mist did not reach, and she looped the reins around a nub of stone that was too rounded for the leather to catch on hard. If June needed to leave, June could leave. Catherine wanted the mare to have that choice. Her father had taught her that too, on a winter afternoon in the store, without ever using the words. She turned toward the cabin. The wind lifted the hem of her father's coat once and set it back down. She was still 5 paces from the door when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the wagon road behind and below her. Not June. June was here. Another horse, shod, heavier. Coming at a walk that was not tired. Coming up as if it belonged to the road. Catherine went very still on the ledge with her hand halfway to the lantern. She listened. The horse came on, unhurried, deliberate, the iron of its shoes ringing once against a bare patch of stone at the last switchback. Then a man's voice, not raised, speaking to the animal in the ordinary way a man speaks to a horse he has ridden a long time. Easy. Easy now. The voice was not old. It was not young. It was somewhere in the middle where a boy has become a man and a man has not yet become anything else. It carried up the ledge over the sound of the falls without the man having to raise it. And Catherine understood, in the way a person understands weather before the sky has quite changed, that the voice belonged to someone who had been on this road before and had expected, one day, to be on it again. She stepped away from the lantern and back against the cabin wall where the shadow of the overhang fell, and she waited. The horse came into view first, a bay gelding with a white sock on the near foreleg and a dark, careful eye. It stepped onto the ledge without hesitation, as though it had been told years ago, where the ledge stopped and where the drop began, and had not forgotten. Its rider sat easy in the saddle. He wore a broad-brimmed hat pulled low, an oilskin coat gone dull at the shoulders from long weather, and a red kerchief knotted at the throat. His hands on the reins were bare. He was not old and not young, exactly as the voice had promised. His face was clean-shaven at the jaw and shadowed under the brim, and Catherine could not, from where she stood, see his eyes. He drew the bay up in the middle of the ledge, where Catherine had sat on June only an hour earlier, and he sat there a moment without dismounting, looking at the cabin. He looked at the open door. He looked at the lantern on the sill. He did not look at Catherine, though Catherine had the certain feeling that he had counted her against the cabin wall the instant the ledge opened up in front of him, and had chosen, for reasons of his own, not to turn his head. He spoke to the bay again. "Stand." The bay stood. He swung down easy, the way a man swings down who has been getting on and off horses since before he could read, and he dropped the reins to the stone. He did not tie them. He walked 3 steps toward the door of the cabin and stopped. "Miss," he said, still not looking at her, "you are welcome to come out of that shadow. I have seen you already." Catherine did not move for a count of 3. Then she stepped out of the shadow of the overhang onto the wet stone. She kept the lantern between herself and him without seeming to. Her right hand rested easy against her hip where the crowbar hung in its loop. Her father's coat was buttoned to the throat. The wind lifted the hem again and set it down. He turned his head then, and she saw his eyes. They were pale, almost gray, and set deep, and they went across her face once the way a man reads a page he has already read and is checking to see if it is the same page. Something in him settled, and something else in him did not. "You would be Brooks," he said. "Catherine Brooks," she said. "I knew your father. he said. A little. Enough to nod to. She said nothing. I did not know he had a daughter old enough to be up here on a horse alone. He had one, she said. He almost smiled at that. It did not reach the pale eyes. He looked past her at the door. You opened it. I opened it. By yourself. Yes. He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed a rumor he had been carrying for some time. That door, he said, has been shut a long while. So, I have been told. By whom, if you don't mind? Catherine considered the question. She thought of Woodrow Sipe setting a staple with his hammer and refusing to say a name. She thought of a Wednesday and a Thursday. She thought of Ezra Pike gone north to his sister. She thought of Halloran counting change with his lip curled. By the town, she said. The town does not go up this road. No. So the town told you what the town has been told. He said it without unkindness. He said it the way a man corrects a child on a small point of grammar. Then he pulled off his hat and held it against his thigh, and Catherine saw a head of dark hair going iron at the temples, and a forehead pale where the hat had lived. He was, she guessed, perhaps a shade older than her father would have been. Perhaps not. Perhaps the mountain had aged him faster than a store had aged Amos Brooks. It was hard to tell on a man like this. My name is Roland Vaughn, he said. I ranch the north bench above Cottonwood Draw. I come up this road once a year or thereabouts to look at the water. I have been coming up since I was a boy. Mr. Vaughn, she said. Miss Brooks. He put the hat back on and touched the brim. They stood a moment. The falls poured. The mist crossed the ledge in slow bands. The bay shifted its weight and did not otherwise move. June, in the fold at the back of the ledge, blew softly, and Roland Vaughn heard it, and turned his head half an inch toward the sound, and turned it back without commenting. May I ask, he said, under what claim you opened this door? Catherine put her hand to her chest through the coat and felt the deed against her skin where she had pinned it. She did not draw it out. Under a lawful one, she said. He waited. A deed of gift, she said. Section 31, Township North above the falls, cabin and appurtenances. Signed by whom? By the man who held it before me. Who was? She did not answer. Roland Vaughn nodded again slowly. He looked at the door and at the lantern on the sill, and then at the black seam of the opening beyond, and Catherine watched his face and could not read it. It was neither surprised nor angry. It had gone a little tired, as though something he had been carrying up the road with him had grown a small measure heavier. Well, he said, that is your business and the county's, and I am neither. I will not press you. He drew a slow breath and let it out. Miss Brooks, I will say one thing, and then I will be on my way for the day, and you will not see me on this ledge again for a while. May I say the one thing? You may. He lifted his chin toward the door. That cabin was shut, he said, by men who understood what they were shutting. It was not shut for weather. It was not shut for grief. It was shut so that certain things inside it would stay inside it. You have opened it. That is done. I will not tell you to shut it again. I would not be listened to. He paused, and his pale eyes went across her face again in that same reading way. I will tell you this. Do not carry anything out of that cabin down into Falls Creek. Not a book, not a tin, not a boot, not a page. Whatever is on the shelf, leave on the shelf. Whatever is on the wall, leave on the wall. If you take a thing out, someone in the valley will know. I do not mean a rumor. I mean know. And that person's knowing is not a thing you want turned on you at 18 years of age. Catherine's breath caught once at the word 18. She had not told him her age. He had said it as a man says a thing he has already been told, or a thing he has counted for himself. She kept her face still. I hear you, Mr. Vaughn, she said. That will do. He touched his hat brim again and turned and walked back to the bay and gathered the reins off the stone and swung up. The bay came around without being asked. Roland Vaughn looked down at her once from the saddle, and she saw the pale eyes for the last time that morning, and he said, in the ordinary voice with which he had spoken to the horse, "Your father was a straight man, Miss Brooks. I am sorry he is gone. I am sorrier your mother is gone. I did not come up here to trouble you. Good day." "Good day, Mr. Vaughn." He rode past her, and past the cabin door, and did not look at either, and the bay's shod hooves rang once on the bare patch of stone at the near edge of the ledge, and then he was down the switchback and out of sight. The sound of the shoes went a long way in the still air before the falls swallowed it. Catherine stood without moving until she could no longer hear the bay. Then she went to the cabin wall and put her palm flat against it and let her forehead rest on the back of her hand, and breathed. She counted to 10. She counted to 10 again. She had not been aware, while he was speaking, of holding anything in her chest. Now that he was gone, whatever it was let go, and she felt the shaking start in her knees and travel up. She did not go into the cabin at once. She walked back to June and put her forehead against the mare's neck and stayed there. June smelled of warm dust and grass, and the faint sweet of the grain Catherine had given her at dawn. Catherine breathed in and out against the gray coat. "He knew me," she said into June's neck. June's ear flicked. Catherine did not say the rest of it aloud. "He knew me, and did not want to know me. He knew me, and was sorry. He knew me, and warned me. He knew my age." She thought of Woodrow Sipe saying he would not name the man because if he named him, he had named him, and if he did not, she would know him when she saw him because he would already know her. She had seen him. He had already known her. She did not need Woodrow to name him now. She was, however, willing to let Woodrow speak the name on Friday if he would. On Friday, she would ride down to the corrals again. Today was still Wednesday. She lifted her head from June's neck. The sun had climbed. The ledge was in full, hard light, and the mist that had crossed it earlier had thinned to a scatter of drops in the air. The white column of the falls was very bright, and the black rock behind it very black. She thought that if she meant to look at the shelf and at the pencil line on the wall, she should look now, while the light was strongest, before she had lost her nerve a second time in one morning. She went to the cabin door. She took up the lantern from the sill. The tin was warm where the sun had touched it. She turned the wick a hair higher and set her hand on the frame, and did not, this time, say the thing her mother had used to say. She had said it once already at this threshold. She thought her mother would have understood that once was enough for a morning like this. She stepped over the sill. Inside, the layered darkness had a shape now that her eyes remembered from the first stepping in. Table, bench, iron stove, bedstead, shelf. The pale rectangle where light leaked through the warp in the shutter had moved a hand's width along the plank floor as the sun had climbed. Catherine lifted the lantern and walked slowly and quietly, as though there were someone sleeping in the room whom she did not want to wake, toward the shelf above the bedstead. She kept her boots from the mattress. She kept her elbow from the bedpost. She held the lantern out from her body so that the light would fall on the shelf and not on herself. The tins on the shelf were dark and dusted. The book at the near end was a slim one, bound in a cloth that had once been dark red and was now the color of dried blood at dusk. The candle stub in its pewter dish had melted once and cooled, tilted. And at the far end of the shelf, upright as a small soldier standing at attention where it had been set down 80 years ago, was the little dark boot. It was a child's left boot, laced with a leather thong, the toe scuffed pale, the heel worn on the outside as a heel wears when a child runs. Catherine did not touch it. She held the lantern near, and looked, and did not touch it. Then she moved the lantern to the wall beside the bedstead, where the pencil line had been, and she leaned in for the first time to read the name. The name at the pencil line was written in the careful, block-lettered hand of a child who had been taught his letters recently and was proud of them. The letters were faded almost to the color of the wood, and Catherine had to hold the lantern very close and tilt her head so the light took the grooves at an angle before the shapes came clear. The name was 3 letters. It was John. Beside the letters, on the same pencil stroke as the line itself, was the number 6. Catherine read it twice. She read it a third time because the second reading had not settled in her, and she wanted to be sure her eyes were not making the letters out of her hope for letters. John, 6. A boy who had stood against this wall on some morning long ago, and a father or a mother who had set a pencil to the wood at the top of his head and drawn a line across and written down his name and how many years he had counted. She held the lantern there a long moment. The light made a small soft circle on the plank, and the letters sat inside it, patient and small. And Catherine understood without needing to argue it that the shelf above the bedstead and the little dark boot at the end of the shelf and the pencil line at the height of a child of 5 or 6 were all one thing and belonged to one small person, and that person had had a name, and the name had been John. She did not lean any closer. She stepped back from the wall by one step, keeping the lantern high, and looked at the pencil line as a whole, the way a person looks at a headstone rather than at the letters carved into it. There was only the one line. There was no second line above it for a boy grown a year older. There was no line below it for a younger brother or sister. There was only John and the number 6, and the wood above the line ran unmarked all the way to the ceiling of dressed timber. Catherine turned the lantern a little to the left, and the light fell across the plank wall beside the bedstead, and she saw what she had not seen at first because her eyes had been on the letters. To the left of the name, some distance from it, low enough that a very small child might have crouched to make it, there was a mark scratched into the wood with something harder than a pencil. It was not a letter. It was a shape. Catherine leaned to look. It was a small 5-pointed star, drawn the way a child draws a star, in one unbroken line that crosses itself, and the point at the bottom left dragged down into a little tail as though the tool had slipped when the hand had finished the shape and was pleased with it and had begun to lift away. The star was scratched, not written. Catherine held the lantern very close and saw the pale, almost white color of the fresh wood in the grooves where the mark had cut through the dark surface. She thought at first of a nail. Then she thought of the tip of a knife. Then she thought of the metal end of the leather thong on the small boot at the end of the shelf, and she did not follow that thought any further, because she did not want to picture the small hand at the end of the small arm bending down to carve its own star into the wall below its own name. She moved the lantern along the wall past the star, past the name, past the bedpost, keeping the flame small. Above the head of the bedstead, she saw the lighter shape where the picture frame had once hung. The shape was an oval, and the wood inside the oval was a shade paler than the wood around it, and the nail was still there in the middle of the pale place, with nothing hanging from it. Catherine looked at the nail and at the oval, and understood that whoever had left this room had taken the picture off the wall on the way out, but had not taken the boot from the shelf, and had not scrubbed the name from beside the bedstead. She stepped back another step so that she stood in the middle of the room, and turned once slowly again as she had turned before, but this time with a different kind of attention. She looked at the room as a room in which a child had lived. The bedstead was long enough for a grown person. It was not a child's bed. But if a child slept against the wall with a grown person on the outside, the child would sleep with his shoulder near the pencil line and his eye near the little scratched star. Catherine did not want to picture that either, but the picture came anyway, and she let it come and let it go. She looked at the table along the opposite wall. She had noted the table before as table. Now she looked at the table as a place where a family had eaten. The bench beside it was long enough for 2, or for 3 if 2 were small. At the far end of the table, tucked underneath, half in the shadow the lantern had not reached until now, was something Catherine had not seen on the first stepping in. It was a small chair. It was a plain plank chair with a low back, sized for a child of 5 or 6. The seat of the chair was scuffed pale in the middle in a soft round shape, the way a seat is scuffed pale by a child who has sat in it every day for a year or 2, and has climbed in and climbed out and swung his legs. Catherine looked at the small chair a long moment, and she understood that whatever she had been prepared to find in this cabin, she had not been prepared to find a small chair, and that a small chair changed the shape of the room again in her mind, and made the plank walls feel less like the walls of a grave, and more like the walls of a home that had been shut before it had finished being a home. She lowered the lantern and rested it on the plank floor for a breath. The pale rectangle from the shutter had crept another finger's width along the boards. She could hear the falls through the wall, not as sound, but as a steady low pressure against the plank behind the bedstead, as though the water outside were leaning gently against the room from the other side of the rock. She could hear no other thing. Catherine lifted the lantern again. She walked, still slowly, still keeping her boots off any board that might sound, to the shelf at the near end of the room above the stove. She had not looked at that shelf yet. On it were an iron skillet turned upside down on its rim, a tin coffee pot with the handle bent, 2 chipped enamel cups upside down beside the pot, a small blue enamel plate the size of a saucer, and a wooden spoon with a burned edge. The plate was smaller than the cups. It was a child's plate. Catherine set the lantern on the plank of the shelf beside the iron skillet, and she stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the small plate and did not lift it. She thought of a morning in the store, years back, when her father had set a small blue enamel plate in front of her at the counter and put on it a piece of cornbread and a slice of yellow cheese, and had said, "Eat, Catherine," and had gone back to the ledger. She had been maybe 7. The plate here on the shelf was not the same plate, but it was the same kind of plate. It was the kind of plate a father in a store in a valley in the 1870s would set in front of a child, at a counter or a table, so that the child would have a plate of her own. Catherine took her hand away from the shelf. She had not touched the plate. She had almost touched it and had not. She thought of Roland Vaughan on the bay gelding saying that whatever was on the shelf must stay on the shelf, and she was glad now that he had said it, because she did not trust her own hand. She picked up the lantern again and stepped away from the stove shelf. She stood in the middle of the room a third time, and she counted the pieces of the child that were in the cabin. The boot on the shelf above the bedstead, the name at the pencil line, the scratched star below the name, the small chair under the table, the small blue plate on the shelf above the stove. 5 pieces. She did not know yet what to do with 5 pieces of a boy she had never met, and whose mother and father she did not know, but she understood, standing there in the middle of the room with the lantern held low, that whatever else this cabin was, it was also the room in which a child named John, 6 years old, had lived, and had eaten from a small blue plate, and had sat in a small chair, and had scratched a star into the wall beside his bed, and had gone. She did not yet ask where he had gone. She did not let the question form fully. She kept it at the edge of her mind, the way a person keeps a lantern outside a door and does not carry it in until the room is ready for the light. She stood there in the middle of the plank floor with the water leaning against the far wall from the outside, and she thought of Woodrow Sipe saying that a man in the valley had spent 40 years making sure no one remembered why the door was shut. And she thought of Roland Vaughan saying that whatever was on the shelf must stay on the shelf, and whatever was on the wall must stay on the wall. And she understood for the first time, and without needing to think it through, that what these 2 men were protecting, from opposite directions and for opposite reasons, was the same thing. It was the boy. It was John. She did not know yet who had shut the door. She did not know yet who John's mother and father had been, though she felt the shape of an answer beginning to gather at the edge of the room, the way weather gathers at the ridge before it moves down into a valley. She did not know yet why a picture had been taken from an oval on the wall and everything else had been left. She did not know yet why the door had been shut from the outside instead of the inside, or why the hasp had been left without a lock. She knew only that she had come up the road looking for a cabin and had found a home, and that the home had been shut in the middle of a Wednesday or a Thursday or a Sunday 80 years ago, with a boy's boot on a shelf and a boy's name on a wall, and that whatever had happened in this room on the morning it had been shut, no one had come back to gather what the boy had left behind. Catherine did not act. She did not lift the boot. She did not open the slim book bound in the color of dried blood at dusk. She did not turn the small chair. She did not touch the plate. She stood with the lantern in her hand and let her eyes learn the room a little longer so that she would know, later, if any of it had been moved. Then she stepped back to the pencil line, and she looked at the letters one more time in the small, soft circle of light, and she said the name aloud in the room, once, quietly, because it seemed to her that the name had not been spoken in this room in a long time and ought to be spoken again by someone who meant it kindly. "John," she said. The water leaned against the far wall from the outside and made no answer. The pale rectangle from the shutter had moved another finger's width along the plank floor. Somewhere on the ledge, out past the door, June shifted her weight and blew softly, and the sound came in through the open door and touched the room and went out again. Catherine turned, lantern in her hand, and walked back toward the door, keeping her boots off the boards that might sound, and stopped at the sill and looked back once at the room from the doorway before she stepped out into the light. Outside the cabin, the air was warm on her face after the cold plank inside, and she stood on the sill until her eyes adjusted and the white of the falls stopped being painful. She set the lantern on the sill and turned the wick down until the flame was a bead. She did not put it out. She meant to go back in. June was where Catherine had left her in the fold of rock at the back of the ledge, standing with her weight on 3 legs, her off hind foot resting cocked and easy. Catherine crossed to her and put her hand flat on the mare's shoulder and stood there breathing until she could feel her own pulse settle into June's slow one. Then she unlooped the reins from the rounded nub of stone and led the mare a little farther back where a broader patch of coarse grass grew from a seam in the rock. She loosened the girth another hole. She slipped the bit again. She let June drop her head into the grass. She thought about the day and the hours she still had. It was Wednesday. Roland Vaughn had ridden down. Woodrow Sipe would not see her Thursday and would see her Friday if she could come. That gave her the rest of this day and tomorrow to know the cabin. She did not think of it any longer as opening it. She thought of it as knowing it. She walked the ledge. She began at the far corner where the wagon road came up onto the stone and paced the distance from the road's last switchback to the cabin door in even strides, and then from the door to the fold where June stood, and then from the fold to the lip where the water fell. She looked for prints. The stone was too hard in most places for anything to hold, but at the edges where dust had gathered in cracks, she saw only her own boot marks and the round cups of June's shoes. She saw where Roland Vaughn's bay had stood, a scuff of iron on stone and a smear of horse-warm damp against the rock where the bay had leaned. She saw no other tracks. She walked around the outside of the cabin. The building was set into the rock on 3 sides. The back and one side wall were the cliff itself, and the plank walls fitted against the stone as if the men who had built it had measured every joint by hand. Along the seam where plank met rock, someone long ago had packed in a mortar of clay and horsehair and pine pitch. In places the mortar had fallen out, and Catherine could see the raw stone behind the wall, wet with seep. In one place the seep had run down inside the wall and left a dark stain shaped like a hand. At the corner nearest the falls, she found what she had not been looking for. A single iron ring, forged plain, was set into the rock about knee-height, its shank driven deep, and the ring itself gone black with age. A short length of rope had been tied to it once, and a bit of that rope, no more than the length of a thumb, was still knotted through the ring and rotted to fiber. She crouched and turned the ring in her fingers. The iron did not move. It had been set there for something to be tied to or something to hold. She could not tell which. She stood up and stepped away and looked at the ring from a distance, and then she looked at the door of the cabin and then at the ring again. The ring was on the side away from the door, in the mist, where no one going in and out would have a use for it. A goat could have been tied there once, or a dog, or a person could have sat there in the shade of the overhang on a summer afternoon and been out of the wind. She did not decide. She went back to June. June had eaten what grass the seam held, and had lifted her head and was looking at Catherine with the mild, tired attention Catherine had known since she was a girl. Catherine put her hand under the mare's jaw and rubbed the loose place there. "One more thing," she said. "Then we rest." She took the crowbar off her hip and the hatchet from the saddle and carried them to the doorway. She did not intend to use them. She wanted them near. She set them just inside the sill, propped against the wall where she would find them by feel in the dark if she needed them. Then she took a length of clean linen from her saddlebag and a small tin of neat's foot oil the blacksmith's wife had pressed into her hand at the loft door before dawn, and she carried these too into the cabin. Inside, the pale rectangle from the shutter had moved another hand's width along the plank floor and now lay across the foot of the bedstead. She did not step through it. She went to the door itself, on the inside, and knelt at the hinges set into the rock. She wiped the iron with a corner of the linen. The rust came off in flakes, and then in a fine red powder. Under the powder the iron was still sound. She uncapped the tin and rubbed a little of the oil into the pin of the lower hinge with her thumb and then into the upper. The iron drank the oil slowly. She worked it in with the ball of her thumb until the surface was dark and even. Then she oiled the latch and the thumb lift and the hasp. She did not touch the doorboards. The boards were the boards a child named John had heard shut behind him or beside him or in front of him, and she did not want to change how they looked. The oil smelled of an old barn and of long winter afternoons in the mercantile when her father would grease the leather of the account book's spines with the same tin. The smell brought her father into the room a little. She did not resist it. She let him be there while she worked. When she had done the hinges, she moved to the stove in the near corner. It was cold, of course. It had been cold longer than she had been alive. But the iron was intact, and the seams were tight, and when she lifted the lid off the top plate with the edge of the crowbar, she saw ash inside, gray and undisturbed, and in the ash a single ember-blackened knot of pine that had not burned all the way through. She replaced the lid. She squatted and looked at the pipe where it went up through the roof. The pipe was rusted at the collar but sound in the belly. Someone had wrapped a length of soft iron wire around the collar to hold it snug. The wire was old, but had not slipped. She thought about who had wrapped that wire. She thought about a man's hand reaching up, holding the pipe steady with the left and twisting the wire with the right, and then coming down off a stool or a box and standing back and looking at his work and being satisfied. She went to the table along the opposite wall. She did not touch the top. She knelt at the near end of the bench beside it and looked at the joints where the bench legs met the seat. The joints were mortise and tenon, pinned with wooden pegs, made by a man who did not use nails where he did not have to. She ran her fingertip along the underside of the seat. It was smooth. It had been planned by hand. She thought about her father's counter in the mercantile, the counter Woodrow Sipe had said her father had built. And she thought about the man from Denver leaning his elbows on that counter now to count out the change he owed her at the end of each week. And she thought that the man from Denver did not know whose hand had smoothed the wood he leaned upon. And the man who had built this bench inside this cabin was of the same kind as her father, and neither man was in the world any longer, and both their works were. She stood. She went once more to the shelf above the bedstead. She did not touch the small dark boot, or the tins, or the slim book. She only looked at how they sat so that if any of them moved, she would know. She counted the tins, 7. She marked where the candle stub in the pewter dish lay tilted, and how the tilt pointed toward the door. She fixed the picture of the shelf in her mind, the way her mother had taught her to fix the picture of a room before leaving it, when they had traveled once to a cousin's wedding 2 counties north and slept in strange beds. Then she stepped over the sill again into the light and did not look back. She spent the rest of the afternoon on the ledge with June. She did small work. She checked the mare's feet, one by one, cleaning the frog of each hoof with the little pick her father had made for her when she was 12. June lifted each foot patiently. Catherine found a small stone lodged in the near forehoof and worked it loose with the pick and dropped it off the ledge into the mist below and heard nothing. She sat with her back against the rock beside the door in the strip of shade the overhang made and ate the second slice of the brown bread and drank 4 swallows of water and rested her hands open on her thighs. Her right palm was scraped and pink at the heel where the crowbar had bitten. She did not mind it. It was the mark of a thing done. She thought about what she had learned that day and what she had not. She had learned that a child named John, 6 years old, had lived in the cabin and been taken out of it, or gone out of it before the door had been shut. She had learned that Roland Vaughn knew her by sight, knew her age without being told, and had come up the road on a Wednesday when he could have come any day. She had learned that Woodrow Sipe was afraid of Roland Vaughn, and could not or would not say his name. She had learned that the door had been oiled and could be shut close to shut and opened again without further ruin. She had learned that the stove would burn if she brought wood. She had learned that the bench and the table and the shelves in the room had been made by a man who had cared to make them well. She had not learned who John's father had been, or his mother, or who had shut the door on that morning 80 years ago, or why, or what the slim book on the shelf held, or what Roland Vaughn had meant when he said someone in the valley would know, not by rumor, but know if she carried anything out. She had not learned why an iron ring was set into the rock at the far corner of the cabin, where no one who used the door would have a use for it. She sat with these things in her lap the way a woman sits with mending, and she did not try to solve them. She let them settle into the order they wanted. The sun crossed the ridge, and the ledge went gold along the top edge of the water and blue in the mist below. Catherine stood, tightened June's girth, put in the bit, and led the mare to the door of the cabin. She took the lantern from the sill. She blew out the flame and let the glass cool before she wrapped the tin in a cloth and hung it back on the saddle. She went to the door and set both hands on it and pushed. The door dragged across the sill and closed to within the width of 2 fingers. She left it that way, as Woodrow Sipe had told her, close to shut as it would go, but not sealed. Then she mounted June, turned her toward the wagon road, and started down. She rode down slowly. The wagon road in the late afternoon was a different road than the one she had climbed in the dark. Every switchback showed her a piece of the valley she had not seen since her father had last driven her out this direction in a wagon when she was small. The falls sounded above her for a long time, and then dropped away behind the ridge, and there was only the sound of June's shoes on stone and dirt, and the wind moving through the aspens. Catherine did not go to Falls Creek. She turned at the fork above the Baptist churchyard and rode 2 miles east along a track she remembered without wanting to, and came at last to the shoulder of the old Brooks place, which was not the Brooks place any longer but a foreclosed quarter section leased for grazing to a man named Boudry. The house had been pulled down for its lumber. The stone foundation was still there, and the well was still there, and behind the foundation, up a little rise under a pair of cottonwoods gone yellow, was the small family plot where her grandfather and grandmother lay, and where her father and mother had been buried in the spring. She dismounted and walked June up to the cottonwoods and dropped the reins. The 4 markers stood in a line. The 2 old ones were sandstone, worn to soft edges. The 2 new ones were pine, unpainted, cut and set by the blacksmith at cost. Amos Brooks. Mary Brooks. The wood was still pale at the edges where the plane had gone. Catherine knelt in the dry grass between her father's marker and her mother's. She did not speak. She took the yellow deed paper from inside her shirt and unfolded it against her thigh and looked at it in the last of the sun. Section 31. Township North, above the falls. Cabin and appurtenances. $1. Ezra Pike's signature, and beneath it, her own in a younger hand. She folded it again and put it back against her skin. Then she took her mother's rosary from her apron pocket and held it in her cupped hands. The beads were dark wood, worn smooth, and the crucifix was small and plain. She did not pray. She said aloud, in a voice that did not carry past the cottonwoods, "There was a boy named John." She waited, as if the graves might answer. They did not. She said, "He was 6. She waited again. Someone shut the door on him and left him inside it. Or shut the door and left him outside it. I do not know yet which. The wind came down off the ridge and lifted the corners of the yellow leaves above her. She thought of her father in the store setting a small blue plate before her, and of Woodrow Sipe turning her right-hand palm up and calling it a Brooks hand. She thought of Roland Vaughn saying her father was a straight man and being sorry that he was gone and sorrier that her mother was gone, and she felt the 2 halves of that sentence settle into 2 different places inside her, one warm and one cold. She stood. She rested her palm flat on the top of her father's marker for a count of 10, and on her mother's for a count of 10, and led June back down the rise to the road. She reached Falls Creek at dusk. She did not ride down the main street. She came in the back way behind the livery through the alley by the freight office, and she saw that the freight office was dark and Halloran's buggy was not at the rail. She led June into the livery yard and unsaddled her by feel in the fading light, rubbed her down with a handful of clean straw, watered her at the trough, gave her a scoop of oats, and closed her into the corner stall, where the boy who slept in the tack room had left the door ajar and a fresh forkful of hay in the manger. Catherine set her saddle on the rack, wrapped the lantern more tightly in its cloth, and climbed the loft ladder with the crowbar and hatchet under one arm and the Winchester in her other hand. In the loft she lay down without lighting the lantern. She did not undress. She kept her father's coat around her. She listened to the horses breathing below her in the dark and to the small settling sounds of the beams overhead. The blacksmith's wife had left a covered tin plate on the folded blanket that served as her pillow, and Catherine sat up long enough to eat what was on it, cold bacon and a boiled potato and a wedge of yellow cheese, and to drink the mug of buttermilk that stood beside it. She set the empty tin at the top of the ladder for the blacksmith's wife to find. Then she lay back and did not intend to sleep, and slept. She woke in the deep of the night. She did not know what had woken her. She lay still with her eyes open and listened. The horses were quiet. The wind had stopped. Somewhere below a board creaked once and then again. She thought it was the boy in the tack room turning over. She waited. The board did not creak a third time. She thought about the slim book on the shelf above the bedstead. She thought about it the way one thinks about a person met once and not spoken to. The cloth of its binding had been the color of dried blood at dusk. It had sat between the seventh tin and the candle stub in the pewter dish. Its spine had faced outward. It had no title she had been able to see in the lantern light. She had told herself she would not open it. She had told herself she would learn the room first and then decide. She had told herself that Roland Vaughan's warning was a warning she had to weigh against the deed pinned inside her shirt and against Woodrow Sipes' paler warning and against Ezra Pike's single word, which had been Brooks. She turned her face into the folded blanket and thought about the pencil line on the wall. She thought about the small chair under the table. She thought about the picture that had once hung above the bedstead and had been taken down and carried away. She thought that if someone in this valley had spent 40 years making sure nobody remembered why the door had been shut, then the slim book on the shelf was the thing that man most feared. She thought that the reason no one had gone up to burn the cabin was the same reason no one had gone up to open it. The man who wanted it forgotten did not know for certain what was inside it and did not dare go in himself. She slept again, more lightly, and woke at the first gray of Thursday. She did not go up. She had told herself she would not go up on Thursday. Roland Vaughan drew his mail at the freight office on Thursday and would be in the town. She dressed the stalls, forked out the soiled straw, carried water, and by the time the sun was over the eastern rim she had earned her breakfast, which the blacksmith's wife brought to her again in the tin pail. Bread, a boiled egg, a slice of ham no bigger than her palm. The blacksmith's wife looked at Catherine and did not ask her anything. She only said, "Eat, Catherine," in the same voice her father had used, and Catherine ate. At mid-morning, Catherine walked to the mercantile and stood behind the counter that her father had built and counted nails into paper twists for a farm boy from the North Bench who did not know her by name and did not care to. The man from Denver was in the back doing his ledgers and did not come out. At noon, Halloran came in for tobacco. He set his coin on the counter without speaking to her and left without waiting for his change. Catherine put the change into an envelope, wrote his name on it, and set it on the shelf under the register for him to find the next time. At 3 p.m, a rider she had not seen before came in and asked for a pound of coffee and a tin of matches and paid in silver, and as he was leaving he said over his shoulder, in a voice that was pitched for her and not for the room, "Vaughan asked after you." Then he touched his hat and went out. Catherine stood behind the counter with her hands flat on the wood her father had planed. She did not move for a long minute. The man from Denver came out from the back and asked if there was trouble, and she said no trouble. He looked at her and went back to his ledgers. That evening she did not eat supper. She climbed to the loft and sat cross-legged on her blanket with the yellow deed unfolded on her knee and the rosary in her right hand and the Winchester across her thighs. She thought about what she had and what she did not. She had 18 years, a mare, a coat, a rifle, a clock, a rosary, a deed, a scraped palm, a name in pencil on a wall 2 hours' ride above her, and one old man on a Wednesday and a Friday who would speak to her in half sentences. She had no father and no mother and no house. She had a town that had already decided she was leaving. She had also, she understood now, a slim book bound in cloth the color of dried blood at dusk, sitting on a shelf above a bedstead in a cabin no one in 80 years had been through the door of but her. And she had the only key to it, which was her willingness to lift it down and open it, and her willingness to bear what was written in it, and her willingness to set it back on the shelf exactly as she had found it, whether she carried its meaning out or not. She thought of Woodrow Sipe saying, "Whatever she found on the shelf, set it back exactly as found." He had not said, "Do not open it." He had said, "Set it back." She lay down. She slept. She dreamed once of a small blue enamel plate. She rose before the sun on Friday, saddled June by lantern in the livery, and rode up the wagon road again. She reached the ledge in the second hour after dawn. The door stood as she had left it, close to shut but not sealed, the width of 2 fingers open. The lantern hung on her saddle. She led June to the fold at the back of the ledge and looped the reins around the same rounded nub of stone. She unwrapped the lantern, struck a match, lit the wick, closed the glass, and turned the flame small. She stood at the door with her hand on the frame. She said quietly, "I mean no harm," as her mother had taught her to say when entering a house not her own. She pushed the door open the width of her shoulders and stepped over the sill. Inside, the light through the warped shutter lay in its pale rectangle across the plank floor at the same angle as the first morning, because the sun was in the same place in the sky. The room smelled less of long shut and more of oil faintly from the hinges. Catherine crossed to the bedstead. She set the lantern on the floor at her feet, out of the way of her elbows. She stood in front of the shelf and looked once at the boot at the end, once at the candle stub in the pewter dish tilted toward the door, and once at the row of 7 tins. Then she reached up with both hands and, without disturbing the tins on either side, lifted down the slim book bound in cloth the color of dried blood at dusk. It was lighter than she had expected. She turned it in her hands. The cloth was worn through at the corners and the boards under the cloth showed pale. There was no title on the spine and no title on the front. She sat down slowly on the plank floor with her back against the foot of the bedstead, out of the pale rectangle, and drew the lantern close to her knee. She laid the book on her lap and opened the cover. The first page held a name written in a firm adult hand in brown ink faded to the color of tea. The name was Jonathan Brooks. Under the name, in the same hand, was written a date, March 1849. Under the date, in the same hand, 3 words, "For my son." Catherine read the name 3 times. She read the date 3 times. She read the 3 words 3 times. Then she closed the book on her finger to keep her place and pressed the back of her other hand against her mouth and did not make a sound. Her father's father had been named John Brooks. Her father had told her that once, at the counter, on an afternoon when she was small, and had asked him where his name Amos came from. He had said his father had been John, and his grandfather had been Jonathan, and that was as far back as he knew. He had not told her that his grandfather had lived above the falls. He had not told her that his grandfather had had a son named John, who was 6 years old, in a cabin behind a shut door. She opened the book again. She turned to the second page. The same firm hand had written across it, in longer lines now. The beginning of what she understood at once was not a diary, but a letter, written slowly over time to a boy who was meant one day to read it. The first line said, "John, if you are reading this, you are a man." The second line said, "I will try to tell you what happened here so that you will not have to guess." The third line said, "And no one in this valley will tell you true." Catherine closed the book again on her finger. She looked up at the shelf, at the small dark boot at the end, and understood, with a slow cold understanding that started in her chest and traveled outward to her hands, that the boot had been left for a boy who had never come back to put it on, and that the book in her lap had been written by her own great-grandfather for a son who had not lived to read it. She understood that she was the first of his blood to open its cover in 80 years, and that whatever the man in the valley had spent 40 years making sure nobody remembered was written on the pages under her thumb. She lowered her face over the book, and the lantern light lay across the page, and she began, very slowly, to read. She read for the length of time it takes a shadow to cross a floor. The letter was written in short passages, each one dated at the top in the same brown ink, and between passages there were blank lines where the writer had put down the pen and gone away and come back another day. Jonathan Brooks had written in a plain, steady hand that did not shake. He named things in order. He named the winter he had come up the road with his wife, whose name was Anne. He named the summer he had built the plank walls against the rock and packed the seams with clay and horsehair and pine pitch. He named the fall the child had come, and the child had been John. He wrote that Anne had died in the second winter of a cough that had begun as a small thing in October, and that he had buried her under a cairn of river stones on the bench above the falls where the sun reached in March. He wrote about the boy. He wrote that the boy had a scar under his chin from a fall against the stove hearth at 3, and that the boy could not sleep unless the candle in the pewter dish was left burning until he closed his eyes. He wrote that the boy had scratched a star into the wall with the metal end of a bootlace one afternoon, while Jonathan was working on the bench, and had looked ashamed when Jonathan came to see it, and Jonathan had told him it was a fine star and to leave it. He wrote that the boy had begun to write his name in pencil in April of the year he turned 6. Catherine turned a page and read a passage dated a month later. Jonathan wrote that a man named Vaughn had come up the road from the north bench in July with 2 others and had stood on the ledge and told him the water was needed downstream, that the mill they meant to build below the falls could not run if a man lived above the falls doing whatever he liked with the flow, and that he must sell the cabin and the section for a price they named. Jonathan had refused. Vaughn had said he would come again. Jonathan wrote the man's first name at the end of the passage, and Catherine read it. Merritt Vaughn. Catherine set her thumb on the name and held it there. She thought of the rider on the ledge 2 days earlier, of gray-pale eyes and dark hair going iron at the temples, of Roland Vaughn saying he had been coming up the road since he was a boy. She thought of Woodrow Sipe saying the man in the valley had been a boy when the door was shut. She turned the page. Jonathan wrote that Vaughn had come again in the fall with only 1 other man, that they had waited at the switchback and not come up onto the ledge, and that the other man had ridden away and Vaughn had ridden back down. Jonathan wrote that he had begun to sleep with a rifle beside the bed and to keep the boy behind him when strangers came to the road. He wrote that he had sent word by a passing packer to a man he trusted in the settlement below to record his deed in the county book, and that the packer had come back 3 weeks later to say the deed was recorded, and the clerk had asked him to say Jonathan should watch the road. The next passage was dated the following spring. Jonathan wrote that John had begun to read a little. He wrote a list of 5 words the boy could read: bread, water, horse, cabin, and father. He wrote them out in the boy's own hand on the page, small block letters leaning forward, the letters made by a boy who had scratched a star on a wall with a bootlace. Catherine touched the page where the boy had written and did not press. She lifted her hand and turned the page. The next passage was written not on a date but under a heading that said only, "The Day." Jonathan wrote that Vaughn had come up on a morning in late May with 3 men, that they had ridden onto the ledge without hailing, and that one of them had been the boy's age plus 15 years, a young man on a black horse whom Vaughn had called Son. Jonathan wrote that he had come out onto the ledge with the boy behind him inside the door and had told Vaughn to go. Vaughn had said he had come for a paper and a signature, not for talk. Jonathan had said there would be neither. Vaughn had then done a thing that Jonathan wrote about slowly, in the shortest sentences in the book. He had drawn a pistol. He had fired once. Jonathan had gone down onto one knee. The boy behind the door had cried out. Vaughn had told the young man on the black horse to go inside. The young man had not moved. Vaughn had said it again. The young man had dismounted and gone to the door and stood in it and looked at the boy and had not gone in. Vaughn had walked past his son into the cabin. Jonathan had heard him. Jonathan had crawled to the doorway on his hand and his one good knee and had put himself in the door. The passage broke there. The next was dated 3 days later. Jonathan wrote that he was writing with his left hand because he could not use his right. He wrote that the boy was not in the cabin. He wrote that Vaughn's son had lifted the boy up onto the black horse and had ridden down the road with him, while Vaughn stood over Jonathan in the doorway with the pistol lowered. He wrote that Vaughn had said to Jonathan on the floor that the boy would be raised in the valley and would not know his father's name, and that if Jonathan lived, he was to go north and not come back and never speak of it, and if he did come back, he would find the boy did not know him. Jonathan wrote that Vaughn had gone. He wrote that he had crawled to the shelf and taken down the candle and lit it and set it in the pewter dish tilted toward the door so that if the boy ever came home in the dark, he would see it burning. Catherine read the passage twice. She lifted her eyes to the shelf above the bedstead and looked at the candle stub in the pewter dish tilted toward the door. She lowered her eyes to the page again. The final entries were short. Jonathan wrote that he had not gone north. He wrote that he had healed slowly through the summer and could walk by the end of it, but not far. He wrote that he had gone down twice into the settlement below, hooded in a coat, and had asked after his son and had been told by two people the same story, that Merritt Vaughn had taken in an orphan boy from the mountain and was raising him as his second son. He wrote that he had seen the boy once at a distance across a corral, and that the boy had not seen him, and that the boy had been given a new name he would not write in the book because he would not write the name Vaughn had put on his son. Jonathan wrote that he had understood then what Vaughn had done, that Vaughn had not needed to kill him because Vaughn had already taken the thing that would have made his living matter, and that going down into the valley to claim the boy would only end in the boy watching him die a second time, or in the boy being told his father was a madman on the mountain who had come for him with a knife. He wrote that he had come back up the road for the last time in October. He wrote that he had shut the door behind him and packed the seam and left the latch open on the hasp so that if the boy ever came looking, the boy could open it, and no other man could say it had been locked. He wrote that he was leaving the book on the shelf between the 7th tin and the candle, that he was leaving the boot the boy had outgrown at the end of the shelf so the boy could see he had been remembered, and that he was going north to die where the boy would not have to find him. The last page was a single line, dated November 1849. It said, "John, I am your father, and I loved you every day." Catherine closed the book. She held it in her lap with both hands flat on the cover and did not move. Water fell against the rock behind the bedstead. The pale rectangle from the shutter had moved a hand's width across the floor while she read. She had not felt it move. She understood then, in one motion of understanding, several things. She understood that the small dark boot on the shelf had been left for a boy who had grown into a man in the valley and had never come up the road to put it on because he had not known there was a road that led to him. She understood that the man in the valley, who had spent 40 years making sure nobody remembered why the door was shut, had not been Merritt Vaughn at all but Merritt Vaughn's son, who had stood in the door and not gone in, and had watched a smaller boy be lifted onto a black horse and carried away, and had grown up in the same house as that boy under the same roof, calling him brother, and had spent 40 years keeping the road quiet, so the smaller boy, now a man, would never know. She understood that the smaller boy, the boy from this cabin, was still alive somewhere in the valley, an old man now, and that he was her own blood. She understood that the man on the bay gelding with pale gray eyes was Merritt Vaughn's son grown, and that when he had said her father was a straight man, and that he was sorry her father was gone, he had meant it, because her father had been the grandson of the boy on the black horse and had lived his whole life inside a name and a story Roland Vaughn had helped to keep from him. She understood that Roland Vaughn had come up the road because he had heard she had the deed, and that he had told her not to carry anything out, because if the book left the mountain, the whole valley would learn that the Brooks who ran the mercantile down in Falls Creek had once been a Vaughn foundling, and before that had been a Brooks child, stolen off a ledge, and that the mill below the falls that had run for 80 years had been built on water taken by a killing. She sat very still and let the cold understanding travel down her arms into her hands and out. Then she opened the book once more, went back to the page where the boy had written the 5 words, and looked at the small, forward-leaning letters. She thought of her father setting a small blue plate in front of her at the counter and saying, "Eat, Catherine." She thought that her father had had that hand from a boy who had learned to write it beside this stove. She closed the book. She lifted it and set it back on the shelf between the 7th tin and the candle stub in the pewter dish. Spine outward, exactly as it had been. She touched nothing else. She stood, took the lantern by its wire, crossed to the door, and stepped over the sill onto the ledge. The light on the water was very hard and very white. June lifted her head from the seam of grass at the back of the ledge and watched her come. Catherine had reached June and put her hand on the mare's shoulder when she heard, from below on the wagon road, more than one horse coming up. She heard iron on stone at the second switchback and then at the first, and she heard the low voices of men speaking to horses. She counted the sounds. 3 horses. She stood with her hand on June's shoulder and did not move. She thought of the crowbar and the hatchet propped just inside the sill, and of the Winchester across the cantle at her back, and she thought very clearly that she was not going to leave the ledge, and that whoever was coming up would find her standing on it. The 3 horses came onto the ledge in single file. The first was Roland Vaughan's bay gelding with the white sock. The second was a taller sorrel Catherine did not know, and on it sat a man in a black coat with a leather satchel across his chest and a flat hat brushed clean of dust. The third horse was Woodrow Sipes' rope-broke roan, and Woodrow was on it, sitting easy, his white brows drawn down against the light off the water. Roland Vaughan led. He did not stop where he had stopped on Wednesday. He rode past the middle of the ledge, dismounted, dropped his reins on the stone, and stood with his hat in his hand. Catherine kept her hand on June's shoulder. She did not reach for the Winchester at her back. She did not look at the door. Roland Vaughan said, "Miss Brooks." Catherine said, "Mr. Vaughan." The man in the black coat swung down from the sorrel. He was not young. His hair was the color of iron filings, and his hands were unmarked by outdoor work. He took the satchel from across his chest, held it at his side, and stood 2 paces back from Roland Vaughan as if he had been told where to stand. Woodrow Sipes stayed in the saddle. He lifted his chin at Catherine one time, small, and Catherine understood he had come to witness and not to intercede. Roland Vaughan said, "I have brought a man." Catherine said, "I see." Roland Vaughan said, "Mr. Wexley, county recorder." The man in the black coat took a half step forward and inclined his head. "Miss Brooks," Catherine said. "Mr. Wexley," Roland Vaughan said. "May we come to the door?" Catherine said, "You may come to the sill, not further." Roland Vaughan nodded once and walked the 10 paces to the cabin. Wexley followed at his shoulder. Woodrow Sipes swung down from the roan then, slowly, with a hand on the pommel, and followed at a distance a horse's length behind. Catherine let go of June and walked her father's boots across the wet stone and stopped at the sill first, with her back to the door, so that the 3 men gathered facing her and the cabin behind her stayed unentered. Wexley opened the satchel. He took out a leather folder tied with a green ribbon, untied it, and turned it so Catherine could see the top page. It was thick paper, ruled, with a county seal pressed into the corner. Wexley said, "I have with me the entry for Section 31, Township North above the Falls, cabin and appurtenances, recorded May, 1848, grantee, Jonathan Brooks." Catherine looked at the page and did not touch it. Wexley said, "There is one further entry, recorded 1860. Transfer of the same section from the estate of Jonathan Brooks, deceased in the North, to his heir at law, one Ezra Pike, held in trust for the Brooks blood." Catherine looked up from the page at Wexley's unmarked hand. Wexley said, "Mr. Pike executed the trust 3 weeks ago in your favor. He filed the deed of gift with my office the same day. It is recorded. It stands." Catherine put her hand against the doorframe. She felt the wood under her palm as she had felt it on Wednesday morning. She said, "In trust." Wexley said, "Yes, ma'am, for 80 years, held for whoever of the Brooks blood came to claim it." Roland Vaughan said quietly, "It came to you." Catherine looked at him. His pale gray eyes did not slide. He held his hat in both hands now, at his belt. Roland Vaughn said, I know what you read. Catherine did not answer. Roland Vaughn said, I have known what was in that book since I was 9 years old. I did not know it was written down. I knew what my father did. I stood in the door and did not go in. I could not lift the smaller boy onto the horse. My father lifted him. I rode down behind them because I did not know where else to ride. Woodrow Sipe took off his own hat and held it at his side. Roland Vaughn said, I kept the road quiet. I kept the story off my brother because he was not my brother by blood, and he did not know it, and he was a good man and a gentle one, and I could not put that weight on him at 10 years, and I could not put it on him at 40, and I could not put it on him at 70. He is alive. He lives in the yellow house at the far end of the cottonwood draw. His name is not Brooks. He does not know it was ever Brooks. He set your father on his knee once, when your father was small, and did not know he was setting his own grandson there. Your father did not know. Your father never knew. Catherine felt the shaking start behind her knees again, as it had on Wednesday, and she let it come and pass through her. She said, You knew my father. Roland Vaughn said, I knew him the way a man knows his nephew when the nephew does not know the uncle. I stood in the back of the church when your father married your mother. I stood in the back of the church when they buried him. I stood in the back of the church when they buried her 3 days after. Catherine said, You did not speak. Roland Vaughn said, I did not have the right. The falls poured on. The mist moved across the ledge in a slow band and passed. Wexley closed the leather folder and tied the green ribbon carefully, and put the folder back in the satchel and stood with the satchel at his side. Catherine said, Halloran. Roland Vaughn said, Halloran does not know the story. Halloran wants the mercantile back for a cousin of his in Denver and wants you out of the county because you keep the counter that your father built and every man who comes in leans on it. That is his whole quarrel with you. That is all it ever was. I will speak to Halloran before nightfall. He will not press you further. He will not press you at all. Catherine said, And the man from Denver? Roland Vaughn said, He holds paper on the store. The paper can be bought. I will buy it. I will put it in your name by Monday if you will let me. Catherine said, I will not take it as a gift. Roland Vaughn said, It is not a gift. It is a debt. Woodrow Sipe made a small sound in his throat that was not a word. Roland Vaughn said, The mill below the falls has run for 80 years on water my father took at a killing. The Vaughn Ranch on the North Bench was built on the profit of that mill. Every fence post I have set was set with money that began in this doorway. I have known it since I was 9. I have carried it alone since my father died. I am 63 years old, Miss Brooks. I will not carry it alone another season. I will not ask your forgiveness because you cannot give it to me for what was done to a man who is dead and to a boy who never knew his own name. I will only tell you what I will do. Catherine waited. Roland Vaughn said, I will make the mill run in the Brooks name. I will sign over the deed to the millworks and the water rights to you and to my brother jointly, and my brother will never know his half was ever anything other than a paper he was asked to sign at the end of a long life. He will sign it because I ask him and he trusts me. The mill will pay a wage to the boy in the tack room and to the blacksmith's wife who fed you, and to the 2 widows in the row houses whose husbands were killed on the flume in the year of the fever. It will pay off the paper on the mercantile. It will keep this ledge as it is. No one will build on it. No one will cut on it. The cabin will stand. The book will stay on the shelf. The boot will stay at the end of the shelf. My brother will die in the yellow house at the far end of the cottonwood draw, not knowing. And when he is buried, I will tell whoever is left to tell. And by then it will be old history, and it will not break him. Catherine looked at the sill under her boots. The mist had beaded again on the plank. She thought of Jonathan Brooks writing, I loved you every day, and of a small blue enamel plate, and of her father setting it before her and saying, Eat, Catherine. She said, You will not tell your brother. Roland Vaughn said, I will not tell him. If you wish to tell him, I will take you to his door, and I will stand behind you while you do. He is your blood. It is your right. I will not stand in the way of it. I only ask that you look at him first before you decide. Catherine said, I will look at him first. Roland Vaughn nodded. He did not move. Wexley said, Miss Brooks, if it is agreeable to you, I will draw the papers on the millworks and the water rights this week and bring them up on Monday morning for signatures. I will bring them here, if you like. Catherine said, Bring them to the mercantile. I will sign them at the counter. Wexley said, At the counter. Yes, ma'am. Catherine said, One further thing. Wexley said, Ma'am. Catherine said, I want a marker set on the bench above the falls where the sun reaches in March, for Anne Brooks, plain stone, my grandfather's wife. Wexley said, I will see to it. The mason in the settlement below cuts a good letter. Catherine said, and one for Jonathan Brooks beside it. Though the ground under it will be empty, he went north. He did not come back. Wexley said, Beside it. Yes, ma'am. Woodrow Sipe put his hat back on. He looked at Catherine, and his very pale eyes were wet at the outside corners, and he did not wipe them. Woodrow Sipe said, Brooks' hand. Catherine said, Mr. Sipe. Woodrow Sipe said, I told you the pieces would come loose first. I did not tell you the rest of him would come with them. I am glad of it. I did not think I would live to see it. Roland Vaughn put his hat back on and stepped away from the sill. He walked to the bay gelding and did not mount. He stood with his hand on the bay's neck and waited. Catherine turned to the door. She set her hand on the frame. She looked back once at Roland Vaughn, at Wexley with the satchel, at Woodrow Sipe with his roan behind him, at June waiting in the fold of rock. She thought of the pale gray eyes of a boy of 15 standing in this same doorway 80 years ago and not going in, and she understood, without forgiving it, that the boy had never left the doorway and had stood in it his whole life keeping others out. She stepped over the sill into the cabin, went to the shelf above the bedstead, and looked at the book between the 7th tin and the candle stub in the pewter dish tilted toward the door. She did not lift it. She lifted instead the candle stub in the pewter dish. She carried it out onto the ledge in the hard white light, held it up so the three men could see it, and said, He kept this burning for the boy. Roland Vaughn removed his hat again. Catherine walked back to the shelf and set the pewter dish down exactly where it had been, tilted toward the door, and she left the cabin, and this time she pulled the door to within the width of a single finger and left it that way, close to shut but not sealed, as Woodrow Sipe had told her on Wednesday, and as Jonathan Brooks had written, he had left it in October of 1849. By the end of the summer, the mill below the falls ran under a new sign, hand-painted by the blacksmith in dark green letters that read, Brooks and Vaughn, and the sign hung on 2 iron hooks. Roland Vaughn set himself into the plank above the flume gate. Wexley brought the papers to the mercantile on the Monday after the ledge, as he had promised, and Catherine signed them at the counter her father built, with her right palm still pink at the heel from the crowbar, and her left hand steadying the page. The man from Denver watched from the back and said nothing. 2 days later, Roland Vaughn bought the paper on the store from him for what it was worth, and not $1 more, and put the deed in Catherine's name in a plain envelope tied with the same green ribbon Wexley used on every folder he carried. Halloran did not come into the mercantile again at supper hour. He came once in the 2nd week of June, in the middle of the afternoon, and stood at the counter with his hat in his hand. He said he had misspoken to Miss Brooks in the winter and the spring, and he would not misspeak again. Catherine counted his tobacco onto the paper for him and slid it across the counter. She said, Thank you, Mr. Halloran. He paid and left the change on the counter and did not look at her going out. Whatever Roland Vaughn had said to him before nightfall on the Friday of the ledge, Catherine never asked, and Roland Vaughn never told. The boy in the tack room, whose name turned out to be Henry, drew his first wage from the mill on the last Friday in June. He brought the coin up the loft ladder to Catherine that evening in his cupped palm and asked her, very seriously, whether he was to save it or to spend it. Catherine looked at the coin and at the boy's face, which was clean of any understanding that anyone had ever thought him worth paying, and she told him to save half and to buy his mother a length of blue cloth with the other half, because his mother had been washing the blacksmith's shop aprons for a year without wages. Henry did as she said. The blue cloth turned into a Sunday dress by the middle of July, and the blacksmith's wife wept a small tidy amount at the sight of it in church and did not tell anyone why. The two widows in the row houses drew their wages on the same Friday and every Friday after. One of them, the older, walked up to the mercantile the following Monday and set a jar of wild plum preserves on the counter without a word and walked out. The other, younger, brought a folded square of white cloth she had embroidered along the edge with small brown stitches shaped like pine cones, and pressed it into Catherine's hand and said, "For your kitchen when you have one." Catherine put the cloth in the drawer under the register, beside the envelope with the deed to the store, and touched it once a day for a long while after. Ezra Pike did not come back before winter, and did not come back after. In October, a letter came down from his sister's place in the high country, in a hand not his own, saying he had gone quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday, and had been buried on the ridge above her house under a rowan tree, and that he had left instructions for the letter to be sent to Miss Catherine Brooks at Falls Creek, and had asked the writer to add one line at the bottom. Silence kept it hers. Catherine read the letter twice at the counter and once more that night in the loft, and then folded it into the yellow deed and did not speak of it. The markers on the bench above the falls went up in the second week of August. The mason from the settlement below rode up with them in a wagon Roland Vaughn had sent, along with 2 men to set them, and Catherine went up on June to be there. The stones were plain gray, cut square with plain letters. Anne Brooks, beloved wife of Jonathan, and beside it, Jonathan Brooks, beloved husband and father. He went north, and under both, on the bases where the sun would find them in March, the mason had cut a small 5-pointed star, one unbroken self-crossing line with a small tail at the bottom left point, without being asked. When Catherine noticed it and looked at him, the mason said only, "Mr. Vaughn told me where to put it," and would not say more. Catherine touched both stars with her thumb and did not speak. Roland Vaughn came to the mercantile once a week through the summer and fall, on Wednesdays, and drank a cup of coffee at the counter that Catherine poured for him from a tin pot she kept on the stove behind. He did not talk of the ledge. He talked of the water in the flume, and the wage list, and the price of oats, and the fall calving on the north bench. He never sat down. He never let his hand rest on the counter longer than it took to set his cup on it. On the last Wednesday in September, he brought her, wrapped in a piece of brown paper, a small framed photograph of a boy on the porch of the yellow house at the far end of the cottonwood draw, taken years earlier when the boy was maybe 5, in a Sunday shirt, holding a hoop. Roland set it on the counter, said, "That is my brother," and did not lift the paper further. Catherine understood he was showing her John at 5, in the second life, in a coat someone else had bought him, on a porch that was not his father's. She looked at the boy's eyes and saw her father's eyes. She wrapped the photograph again and gave it back. Roland took it, nodded once, and put it inside his coat. Woodrow Sipe came in on Fridays. He sat on the barrel by the stove and drank his coffee and told Catherine small things about the country. Which fence on the Merriweather place had gone over in the last wind? Which spring had come up strong in July? Which of the aspens on the wagon road had turned first? He did not turn her hand over again. He did not need to. On the second Friday in October he said from the barrel, without looking up, "You have a Brooks quiet too." Catherine said, "Mr. Sipe." He nodded, and drank his coffee, and paid his nickel, and left. Roland Vaughn's brother did not learn. He came into the mercantile twice that summer, once for a tin of pipe tobacco, and once for a spool of black thread for his wife, and Catherine served him both times without her hands shaking on the second visit. He was a tall old man with pale gray eyes gone almost blue with age, and a slow, careful way of counting his coin, and a kindness in his voice when he called her Miss Brooks that Catherine had not heard from anyone in the valley since her father died. She wanted, both times, to walk around the counter and put her arms around him. She did not. She thought of what Roland had asked of her on the ledge, that she look at him first before deciding, and each time, looking at him, she decided again. She let him carry his tobacco out into the sun and get on his wagon and drive down the road toward the yellow house at the far end of the cottonwood draw, with his wife beside him and his old dog on the boards behind him, and she did not follow. Roland was right that the weight would not fit on shoulders that had carried a different life for 70 years. Catherine kept the weight instead. She found she could carry it. Her father, she thought, had carried heavier and had not known he was carrying anything at all. She went up to the cabin once a month through the summer and once more in October before the snow. She brought oil for the hinges and a little brown bread for herself and a handful of oats for June. She never took anything out. She left the door within the width of a single finger, close to shut but not sealed every time. She swept the plank floor once, gently, with a bundle of pine tips tied with string, and set the bundle by the stove and left it there. On the September visit, she took the pewter dish down, cleaned the old wax out of it with a warm cloth, put a fresh candle stub into it from her apron pocket, lit the candle with a match, watched it burn for a count of 100, blew it out with her breath held so no spit reached the wick, and set the dish back on the shelf tilted toward the door. She did the same in October. She thought she would do the same every year she was allowed to. Catherine turned 19 on the first day of November. The blacksmith's wife made a small yellow cake with molasses and set it on the counter at supper hour, and the boy Henry came in with 2 other boys from the livery and sang a short flat song none of them quite knew the ending of, and Woodrow Sipe brought a pair of new leather gloves too large for her hands and told her she would grow into them. Roland Vaughn did not come, because it was not a Wednesday, but a letter arrived from the north bench in his hand, and inside the letter was a small pressed sprig of sage from the ledge, and one line, "The water still runs. So do you." Catherine kept the sprig in the drawer under the register with the embroidered cloth and the deed to the store. By the first hard frost, the mercantile had been repainted, and the sign above the door had been relettered in the same dark green as the mill sign, in the blacksmith's hand. Brooks, nothing more. Catherine had asked for nothing more. The man from Denver had gone back to Denver by the middle of September, on a train from the settlement below, with the money for the store folded in his coat and no forwarding word. Halloran continued to run the freight office, and continued to lift his hat to Catherine in the street, and did not come into the mercantile again, except when he needed something he could get nowhere else, and then he paid and left the change on the counter, and did not linger. On a Sunday in the middle of November, the first true snow came down onto Falls Creek in the night, soft and quiet, and Catherine woke in the loft. She still slept in the loft, though she could have moved into the rooms above the store, and would in the spring, and dressed in the dark in her father's coat, and went down the ladder past the sleeping Henry, and saddled June by lantern, and rode up the wagon road one more time before winter closed it. She reached the ledge at the beginning of golden hour, when the low winter sun came over the eastern ridge and struck the top of the falls, and turned the whole white column into a column of hammered brass, with the pool below still in blue shadow. The stone of the ledge was dusted with snow the depth of a fingernail. June's iron shoes rang cleanly on it. There were no other prints. Catherine dismounted and led June to the fold at the back of the ledge, loosened her girth a hole, slipped the bit, and let her stand. She walked to the cabin door. The door stood as she had left it in October, within the width of a single finger, close to shut, but not sealed. She did not open it further. She stood at the sill with her hand on the frame, and looked at the strip of dark inside, where the shelf above the bedstead would be, where the pewter dish would be tilted toward the door, and the 7th tin, and the small dark boot at the end of the shelf, and Jonathan Brooks's letter to a son named John between them, spine outward, unopened by any hand but hers. She turned and looked out over the ledge. The falls poured on. The mist rose. Below the ledge, out of sight through the pines, the wagon road bent down to the mill, and beyond the mill to Falls Creek, and beyond Falls Creek to the yellow house at the far end of the cottonwood draw, where an old man with her father's eyes was, at this hour, likely sitting by his stove with a cup of coffee and a Sunday paper he could not quite read any more, kept warm by fires his son had bought him with wages he did not know had begun in this doorway. Catherine took the yellow deed from inside her shirt and looked at it once in the winter light. The ink had not changed. She folded it again and put it back against her skin. She thought of what Woodrow Sipe had said on the barrel by the stove, and of what Roland Vaughn had written in his letter, and of what Ezra Pike had said at the very beginning, when he had pressed the folded square of yellow paper into her palm 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. She thought of her father's counter and the small blue plate, and her mother saying, "Eat, Catherine." She thought of a candle in a pewter dish tilted toward a door for 80 years, waiting for a boy who would come home in the dark. She did not name what she had inherited as a cabin, or a mill, or a store, or a name, because none of those was quite the thing. She said aloud, to the ledge and the water, and to June behind her and to no one else, "I am the door he left open." The falls did not answer. The mist rose. June blew softly in the fold of rock. The sun climbed another hand's width and gilded the sill, and the small dark boot inside on the shelf, though Catherine could not see it from the sill, was in that moment touched by the same light. Catherine stood a long while more. She did not go in. She pulled the door to within the width of a single finger and left it that way, and turned and walked back across the ledge to her mare, and tightened the girth, and slipped in the bit, and mounted and rode down the wagon road slowly in the new snow, in her father's coat, with her mother's rosary in her apron pocket, and the yellow deed against her skin, and a name in pencil on a wall 2 hours above her that she now carried in her own hand every time she signed the ledger at the counter her father built. Thank you for staying with Catherine to the end of this long road, for sitting with the quiet weight of a door left open, a candle kept lit, and a name finally spoken out loud. If this story warmed you, leave a kind word below. Tell us where you're listening from, and follow along for the next tale, coming soon. A young widow, a starving foal on a winter morning, and a leather-bound ledger no one in the valley wanted found.